Christian or Northern Renaissance humanism, which really focused on reforming Christianity. A specific example is Erasmus, who wrote The Praise of Folly and really focused upon criticizing the church, and this led the foundation for Martin Luther. Furthermore was pluralism and absenteeism within the church, and this really established much chaos as church priests would take multiple offices and positions but were unable to handle and control all of them. Thus, lessers, underlings in studies had to take the position of these priests, and they were often undereducated and were unable to provide the correct biblical analysis as well as sometimes even read the Bible. And this was a major problem, was the education provided to priests. Furthermore, there was a major problem within the church of the sale of indulgences. Specifically, Leo X, who was a pope, issued a major sale of indulgences to pay for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Indulgences were sold to help shorten the length of time spent in purgatory, which was seen as an uncomfortable waiting room between heaven and hell. And many people bought them, but Luther saw this practice as really corrupt, and this led to his 95 Thesis. Luther posted his 95 Thesis in 1517, right after Leo X issues these indulgences, and he specifically criticizes the church for much of its corruption, but mostly this sale of indulgences that occurs. Not only is Luther against the sale of indulgences, but he has many other ideals to his religion. He specifically calls upon the sacraments, which he only really keeps two of, baptism and the Lord's Supper. However, he interprets the Lord's Supper as the actual physical body and blood, rather than just a symbol of blood and wine. This idea was called transubstantiation, and it was also outlined in really scripture, which was the basis of Luther's religion. He said justification by faith alone. He thought the individual and God should have a relationship through the work of the Bible, which was the sole authority. Luther's ideas quickly spread all throughout Europe and influenced others, such as the Anabaptists, who were this group that favored peasants, local lower classes, and really supported democracy. But overall, this group was mainly known to separate the church and the state, which they thought should have been separate groups. Another person to be influenced by Luther's Reformation was a different Protestant group called the Calvinists, whose leader was John Calvin. They specifically believed in predestination, which predestined some people to be saved and others to be damned. So God had already decided who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. However, this still led them to live a godly life, as the chosen ones of God had to give good works. And furthermore, he also supported the justification by faith in the absolute sovereignty of God and the Bible. But he did differ from Luther's ideas, as he felt the Lord's Supper was only in a spiritual sense, whereas Luther did in fact believe that it was the physical embodiment of Christ.
John Knox is a Scottish Calvinist reformer who saw Geneva, the center of Protestantism, as the most perfect school of Christ on earth. He is regarded as one of the main founders of the Church of Scotland. He developed many concepts and ideas which have a huge influence on the doctrines and conventions of the Church of Scotland and its splinter churches.
In response to all these new Protestant groups, the church really wanted to get their game back, so they decided to establish and ordain this Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was a group of cardinals and bishops and theologians that sought to reform the church and make it better. They had few meetings and weren't as effective as they could have been due to plague, war, and pope changes. However, by the end of their work, they were able to unify the church and really get rid of corruption, such as the sale of indulgences. But they also were able to reestablish the supremacy of the Pope.
Ignatius Loyola founded the Society of Jesus, also known as Jesuit, in 1540. Before he founded Jesuit, he experienced spiritual torment like Luther, but was able to resolve his problems by submitting his will to the will of the Church, to be a soldier of God. He prepared his life work through prayer, pilgrimage, and education. He also published Spiritual Exercises, which was a training manual for the spiritual development, emphasizing exercise by which the human will could be strengthened and made to follow the will of God as manifested through the Catholic Church. As the creator of Jesuit, he was the first general of the order until his death in 1556. One of the chief instruments of the Catholic Reformation was the Society of Jesus, also known as Jesuit. It was founded by Ignatius Loyola in 1540, based on the principles of absolute obedience to the papacy, a strict hierarchical order for the society, the use of education to achieve its goals, and a dedication to engage in the conflict for God. The Jesuit organization resembled the structure of a military command. A 2-year novitiate weeded out all but the most dedicated adherents. Executive leadership was put in the hands of a general, who nominated all important positions in the order and was to be revered as the absolute head of the order. The main goal of the Jesuits was to fight against Protestantism. They achieved this goal by establishing highly disciplined schools and spreading the Catholic faith among non-Christians, especially in India and China. Their missions in Asia created conduits of trade and provided knowledge of the foreign land. The English Reformation was initiated by Henry VIII, who wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she's failed to produce a male heir. Furthermore, Henry has fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. Anne doesn't want to be the king's mistress anymore and wants to be his wife. And the king desires to have a legitimate male heir, so he tries to divorce Catherine. He relies on Cardinal Wolsey to allow him to get Pope Sigismund VIII to verify the divorce and to recognize his marriage with Anne. Unfortunately, they are not allowed to do that. So with help from Thomas Cranmer, he is able to dissolve the marriage through the English court in distance the Church of England from the Catholic Church. This allows him to marry Anne Boleyn. With his marriage with Anne, they produce Elizabeth I. In 1539, he passes the Act of Supremacy, and he kills Anne Boleyn for adultery. Then he marries Jane Seymour, who produces his male heir, but she dies 12 days after the birth. He then marries Anne of Cleves, who he divorces. Then he marries Catherine Howard, who is beheaded for adultery, and then he marries Catherine Parr, which he dies before Catherine can die. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy completed the break between the Church of England and the Catholic Church. It officially made the English monarch the head of the Church. It gave the ruler, Henry VIII, the ability to control doctrine, clerical appointments, and discipline. Along with this act, Parliament passed the Treason Act, which made it punishable by death to deny that the king was supreme head of the church. The Elizabethan settlement is the religious policies of Queen Elizabeth I of Tudor England. Enacted in 1559, it repealed the Catholic legislation of Mary's reign and designated Elizabeth as the only supreme governor of this realm, as well as in all spiritual or ecclesiastical things or causes as temporal. This title was different than Edward the Fourth and Henry VIII because she didn't want to upset the Catholics who considered the Pope as the supreme head, or the Protestants who thought Christ was the only head of the church. Additionally, the Act of Uniformity restored the church service of the Book of the Common Prayers from the reign of Edward IV, with some revisions to make it more acceptable for Catholics. The 39 articles define theological issues midway between Lutheranism and Calvinism. Her settlement was mostly Protestant, but was a moderation of Protestantism that avoided overly subtle distinction and extremes. The Index of Forbidden Books was created by Cardinal Carfa, later known as Pope Paul IV. This was a list of books that Catholics were not allowed to read. It included works of all Protestant theologians, as well as authors considered unwholesome, such as Uranus. John Tetzel sold indulgences with the German slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." He used the collected money to build the St. Peter Basilica in Rome. Tetzel and his indulgences were a key aspect of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg ended religious warfare in Germany. It formally recognized the divisions of Christianity, which granted Lutheranism equal legal standing with Catholicism. It also accepted the right of each German ruler to determine the religion of his subjects. In 1521, Martin Luther was convicted of heresy by Charles V and was summoned to appear before the Reichstag, the imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire. Luther was confronted by a pile of his books and was asked if he wished to defend them or reject them. Surprisingly, Luther defended them all and asked to be shown where any part was in error on the bias of Scripture and plain reason. His response became the battle cry of the Reformation. Unfortunately, his works were sentenced to burn, and he became a wanted outlaw within the Holy Roman Empire. As a result, he went into hiding.